welcome to another amazing episode of Say It Online, where we help digital agency owners stop just randomly shouting into the void and start communicating meaningfully and effectively in this digital age. I'm your host, Say Gabriel, and this episode was brought to you by our sponsor, Nancy Content. If you're sick of conversion content being a huge pain in your agency's butt, especially websites, campaigns, etc., let's talk. With the smoothest content process ever, a team of unbelievably skilled and organized content strategists, and years of subcontracting experience, Anansi is looking to make your life as a digital agency owner unbelievably easier. Just head, if you're interested, to anansicontent.com, that's ANANSI content.com, and hit Let's Talk. And now, without further ado, here's our episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Digital Agency Real Talk. I'm here with my co-host, Celene Hogue. I am your host, Say Gabriel, and today we're going to be talking about scaling up from a team of one. So if there are any of you guys out there who are solopreneurs and thinking, wondering whether or not to scale, wondering what scaling looks like, wondering who your first hire should be, then this will be the episode for you. So welcome, Celene.
Hi, I'm so stoked. I say this every single week, but every single week I'm like equally stoked and amped to be doing this.
Yeah, it's kind of cool as we've been doing this, time after time. And I know we don't release episodes every week, but we record them almost every week. It's really cool, the breadth of topics that we covered. I know that one of the more recent sets of episodes we recorded around decision fatigue, both for you and helping other people avoid decision fatigue. I've already been quoting it all over the place. It was really awesome. It really got me going. Awesome. But today, as I already mentioned, we're going to be talking about scaling up from a team of one. So this is something that a lot of solopreneurs think or dream about, but actually figuring it out and taking those steps can be daunting. And for those of you guys who aren't aware, I actually started Anansi as a solopreneur only about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe somewhere between those two. And we scaled up, as most of our listeners know. We are now a team of 8, and 8 is our mature size. We might bring on, like one other person or something, but we're not planning to in the near future. And it has definitely been a journey as we have moved through this. So we're going to talk about some of the aspects of, why you might actually want to or not want to scale up in terms of people, right? Because different businesses can look a lot of different ways. But even if, you are somewhere or anywhere along that journey, not just, a solopreneur, but maybe you've hired your first assistant, you're a team of 3, you're not sure whether you want to stay there or get bigger, or maybe if you're a team of 8 even already and kind of wondering what it would be like even maybe to scale back or something. I know that's something that some of the leaders I'm connected to have had to do either by necessity or design. This will be an interesting episode for you, I think. I think we'll have lots of gold in here. So why don't you kick us off, Celene?
Well, I guess kind of first of all, let's start at the beginning. Why would somebody even want to scale? I mean, from my perspective and talking to a lot of agency owners and being involved in groups, probably the biggest thing that I see and hear about is when you're a solopreneur, you experience this too, especially when I was starting, get so overwhelmed trying to balance working on their businesses versus working in their businesses. So they're trying to fill every single seat. They're wearing all the hats. They're doing sales. They're doing project work. They're trying potentially, hopefully, to build processes, improve their services. They're doing all the admin and all the back, they're doing everything themselves. And there's kind of one of two things that happens. The first thing is they're working 60, 70 hours a week and perpetually burned out. And they're either on top of the ball, but working like mad, or they're dropping balls sometimes because they're so overwhelmed. The other thing that even when we were a small team we faced is that kind of sales capacity roller coaster where you put on your sales hat, you sell a bunch, and then suddenly you're so overwhelmed with projects. You're just doing projects. You have no time for sales. And then these projects end and suddenly you have no revenue. and you're like, oh shoot, I have to put back on my sales hat. And so it kind of starts, that cycle just keeps going over and over again. And I mean,
that's huge. That one in particular, I'm like, oh, it's like stab twist. I feel that pain a lot.
Yeah.
It's not far enough back to be forgotten yet.
And then, like in the longer term, right? Like a lot of entrepreneurs, eventually they want to reduce their hours or step out of business, whether it's because they want to start a family or spend more time with their family, or they want to retire, or they want to like live that entrepreneurial dream where they're like working from a beach like once a week and like always traveling to a new place and making like millions of dollars with a private jet or whatever. You see like those ads for like virtual entrepreneurs that are like trying to say how successful they are. But it's important though, eventually, that a business doesn't 100% rely on you all the time. If, you get like sick or have some sort of injury or a family emergency, or even if you want to go on vacation, that your business is still operating without you needing to be there for every single moment and every single aspect of the business.
Yeah. And I do think that there is this strong sense of the entrepreneurial dream, right? Which is eventually making money, either like being a digital nomad, financial independence, retiring early, or even selling the business. If you have a business that you ultimately want to sell, or that's, part of your long-term goal, or maybe you're just, tired of running it or will get tired of running it, then definitely having people and systems in place that aren't just you can be very, very appealing to people. Obviously, people want to buy something that's well established and that is easy to take over, right? Without most of it running in your head. That being said, though, we just want to be clear here that it's not, there's kind of just like in relationships, some of you guys may have heard of this idea of the relationship escalator, where there's this idea that the kind of only valid direction for a relationship is that, you start seeing somebody, you date, you move in together, you get married, you have kids, et cetera, et cetera. There's kind of this idea for businesses as well, which is that, you start off as a solopreneur, kind of like what we did, right? There's this idea, you start off as a solopreneur or a partnership, and then you hire an assistant, you gain a small team, and eventually, you retire or sell to drink and spend your time drinking margaritas, making crazy amounts of profit while, the business keeps going on its own. And while both the relationship escalator and the business escalator are very valid goals and dreams, that's totally okay if that's your plan. It's also totally okay if it's not. Right? Like in the same way as in relationships, if you choose to not have kids, or if you choose to pursue an alternative relationship, or, just be single or something like that, that's all totally valid. Like you're not like going to have a crappy life of relationships if that's what you pursue, because that's what you desire. It's the same thing for business, right? Like there are a lot of reasons why you might want to stay a solopreneur or a super small team, or just work with contractors, etc. And there are definitely ways to make that work and make that be profitable and successful, and some very clear advantages to that as well. Did you want to share some reasons why someone might want to remain on their own?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I guess, first of all, a lot of agency owners, entrepreneurs, like myself and yourself included, although we've gotten better at this, are control freaks, right? If you hire someone, like suddenly you don't have 100% ultimate control. Like you have to trust someone else to do things who may not do it as good as you do it, or the way you do it. So you are giving up some sort of control. You have the hassle of managing and organizing a team, which as you grow, like, if you just have one assistant or something, then you're not spending a lot of time managing. But the more you grow, the more you have to manage, the dynamics, the roles, the relationships, keeping on top of what everyone's doing and when things are getting done, making sure all the pieces are working together towards the right deadlines, all that kind of stuff. It can take up a lot of time.
Let's not forget hiring and firing. Like those are some of our most requested and popular topics around the kind of digital agency real talk stuff we do and sharing our resources. And there's a reason for that. It can be frickin' tough to hire effectively and to fire appropriately.
Yes.
And it can be stressful as well, and definitely had a whole other dynamic to your work, right? And if you like the production part of your work, then having to like manage people and hire people and fire them and be responsible and have all those difficult conversations. I mean, we're always going to have to deal with people as business owners or business leaders, but yeah, that can be a lot on top of it.
That is so true. Other things like the more people you have on the team, the more like proverbial mouths there are to feed. There's higher overhead, right? So like what happens if sales dry up and suddenly you have this team of salaried employees that you have to pay and you have no revenue to pay them with? Like if you're an entrepreneur, like maybe you'll have a couple lean weeks or something, but it's still like I guess if you still have bills to pay and hopefully there's ways to, you can mitigate that. But when you have employees to pay, like you got to pay them. Like you can't just not pay them if there's no revenue. You can't just kind of eat it. And you still have to cover their salaries.
Yeah, that's big and that's scary. And, just being real here, that has definitely been like as someone who's gone through, growing and as a team of 8, like we are in the grand scheme of things considered a tiny team. But if you're coming from the like mostly solopreneur or small team world, then that's more people than you've probably ever had to manage, deal with and talk to on a regular basis while you're in charge. Unless you're coming from the corporate world, perhaps. But definitely if you're coming from that solopreneur, entrepreneur background. And this has been one of the biggest scary things, I would say, just in terms of like scariness, is like there are a whole bunch of people who depend on us every single month to pay their salaries. Like we are their full-time job. We are how they pay for their rent and their food and their kids sometimes. And there's kind of, when it's a partner, you talk about how you're going to make things work. Even if things are going well, and there's lots of money coming in and stuff, this is just something that is still new enough for me that I find myself aware of it. And it is something that keeps me up at night. Like, oh my gosh, what if things tank, or what if the industry changes, or what if there's a recession, So that's just not just a financial burden, right? Similar to like having an office. Having an office can be a big financial overhead as well. If you have people, that might have to be an option for you, although remote workplaces are becoming more and more popular, I'd say. But that's something to consider, right? Is that you do have some responsibility for these other people's lives beyond just the financial. And for me, it's really important to provide a really good workplace for people that they're happy to come to work and happy to do their best work. At the same time, as you know, I have high standards for what that best work is. So if that whole world is terrifying to you and not where you want to go, that's totally okay. For me, I've actually found that despite the kind of like scariness and emotional pressure of it, I love it. Like I love having, remote work can be a little bit isolating. I would say that's something else to mention kind of on the pluses side. Is if they're on the downside, there's like a lot more like chaos and communication and etc. I find I really, really love having the opportunity to connect with the same group of people over and over again that I help to kind of like select and choose and mold, who are passionate and love what they do and are contributing. Like I love that. But that exact same thing that I love, I have spoken to other people where it is like terrifying and horrible for them, and that's totally okay.
Yeah, I feel like if in an alternate universe, if I wasn't at Anansi, first of all, I think I'd be like way too terrified to ever start a business on my own. But if I did, I would also be like so terrified to have a team that's like solely my responsibility without a partner. I don't know. I would probably be terrified, but I don't know. I might still do it in this hypothetical like parallel universe, alternate reality. Yeah. But we'll talk about this a bit more later too, but some of these things can be mitigated by different options. Like for example, there's kind of an in-between route between like being a solopreneur and hiring, where you have like maybe a contractor or a white label agency or something doing some aspects of the work, where they're not employees, where you have to pay them every single the same salary every single pay period, but you can kind of scale them up or down depending on your workflow that's coming in. So that's helpful too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, some of the techniques that we're going to talk about can be combined as well, in the sense that, we started out with a mix of contractors and white label agencies and, grew to hire more like full-time employees. There's VAs, there's lots of other stuff. that you can kind of combine to create the business of your dreams, right? Because this is all about creating the business that you want to lead and work in. That is really the goal of all of this. And also working in that business in the position that you desire to be working in, right? Like most of the people that we work with desire to be in higher level leadership positions in the sense that they own or are a partner in or in a high leadership position in a business, but they find themselves in the weeds a lot of the time, like putting out fires, working on stuff that maybe isn't your highest value work, right? So the idea behind this is twofold, really building the business that you want to own or work in or lead, but also working in it in the position that fulfills you.
Yeah. And it's funny. I've actually met it's obviously not the most common, but I've met a couple people who don't want any of the aspects of being a leader running in the business. They just want to do project work and not have to worry about sales or processes or anything else. And they only want to do project work. And so they end up hiring all the other kind of pieces around it so they can just do what they love and do their project work without having to actually run a business too much.
Yeah. And I will say, because I know quite a few people like that as well. And that's also a totally valid and awesome business model. But if you really only want to be doing the production work and you are not moved to do all of those other parts of running a business, that can be challenging in my experience as a solopreneur. Because unless you are highly, highly, highly niched down and, have a really, really good marketing engine, sales in particular can be really challenging because that referral, if you're operating on referral only, that's a very risky position to be in. There are definitely businesses that I know who have been comfortably successful, if not outright wealthy, for 10 or even 20 years, and then had it just abruptly dry up as the industry changed, and that can be quite challenging. So referral, if you only want to be doing the work part of it, so the production work part of it, you may want to consider maybe even just a partnership. I've heard of quite a few successful partnerships where one person takes care of all the production work and one person takes care of more of the sales and marketing stuff. And maybe you hire out for some of the money and accounting stuff. That can definitely be very, very successful. But it's very difficult to run a business as a solopreneur and only do the production work. Mm-hmm. Just going to be real about that. If you disagree, feel free to tell me, but I speak to a lot of entrepreneurs and that's not a situation I've seen working successfully often without another stream of income at least.
No, I totally agree with that. Yeah. So I guess, I know a lot of people, they kind of accidentally scale where they're like, oh shoot, I need this. Let's just hire someone, and they maybe get a friend or someone they've heard of, or, the first person they talk to who can do this job. And they just kind of become it doesn't always become an unwieldy monster. Sometimes they scale and it works out really well, but they don't really, it just kind of happens. I'm sure anyone who's ever heard us talk, or the world's most biggest, ridiculous, plan ahead nerds ever. So, we actually sat down and had that talk, how do we want to scale and when? What do we want to look like staff-wise in 10 years? And what are those positions? And which ones come first, second, third, etc. So yeah, okay, now I'm flipping and asking you questions, but what are some of the things that people should consider before they even start to scale?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to understand is what it's like when you are, what it's like at different kind of levels and sizes of business or team or etc. And what I mean by that is, like I mentioned, as a solopreneur, there is quite a bit that you can do just as a solopreneur, but you're probably going to be wearing a whole bunch of hats unless you bring in a few key contractors, right? So if you being a solopreneur, we've already talked about this, right? Maybe it's just you. Maybe it's you and an assistant. Maybe it's just you and a partner, right? I've seen all of those situations work fairly well. But at that point, it's going to be extremely high touch, right? Like you are going to be high touch with almost everybody that you interact with, including your VA and your partner and the clients and your prospects and everything. It's just super high touch. But at the same time, you have generally very little overhead and very high profit. Now, by comparison, if you're working with, let's say, a team of like 2 to 3, so, maybe a partnership and a VA, for example. This is still high touch, but you tend to be able to start to bucket more in this situation. So what I mean by bucket is the example I just gave about, let's say one person is doing most of the sales and one person is doing most of the production. That in itself, the amount of kind of switching between things that you have to do, as well as the capacity to, get out of that sales roller coaster, that roller coaster we were talking about where you sell, and then you have to take a break from selling to produce, deliver, right? Like even just having 2 full-timers who are committed can really break things up. I strongly suggest, actually, just as a side note, throughout this whole process, I strongly suggest that you attempt, if you're considering kind of how big you want to grow, or especially if you have started to grow and you're not really sure what it's looking like or kind of who's who in terms of roles, build out just a simple accountability chart. What that means, and you can find a whole bunch of resources on this online, we use mind mapping tools, is without looking at the people, think about all of the different roles that make your business go. And the 3 high-level buckets that we use all the time are projects and operations, admin and finance, and sales and marketing. And then you can kind of divide up those buckets further as you grow or as you need to. But who's responsible for those categories, right? Is it you? Do you foresee, a VA or someone handling parts of that? Is there a contractor or a white label agency you can use? Or would you like to have a team to cover some of those things? Because those things will need to be covered one way or another. The next kind of bucket for teams for sizes of teams, I find is in the kind of 4 to 10 range. So what I found is that in the 4 to 10 range, it's small enough that as a leader, you're still directly touching most of the people in the business. And they are all, for the most part, touching each other, depending how siloed their positions are. But it's small enough that if you need to get everyone in a room to talk, or a virtual room, you can do that. At this point, I found the jump from 4 to 8 very quick, not just because we moved it quickly, but because if you're looking at that bucketing system, you start to be able to see, depending on how much production you have to do, right? Like whether there are seats that you need to basically copy. For instance, we started out by splitting the production seat, so that I was doing all the strategy and working with writers to do all the writing. And we had a whole bunch of writers and one main strategist person. And then Celene and I started working together to make it all happen after she joined the team. And she was helping to kind of screen the writers and direct the writers and et cetera. And over time, we came to realize that a single person who could manage the strategy and the writing and lead all of it and do the project management for that was tougher to find, but way smoother for the process. And so that was one of our, decisions to shift to a more in-house team, was seeing what it was like in terms of working with contractors and splitting that role. And we came to find that actually when we looked at an accountability chart, just having one seat that was one point of contact that did all of that was simpler for us, simpler for the client, simpler all around. And that's one of the ways that we kind of grew quicker from 4 to 8, is not because we added 4 different people with 4 different responsibilities and roles, but because we came to see that once we had one person who was trained to do it and successful, we could copy that and grow that way. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked here. But the next thing, kind of the next size up is when you get to kind of that 14, I would say that 10, 14 to 25 size. Now, this is bigger at this, obviously, but at this size, you start to need middle managers of some kind, right? Like you as a leader need at least one other person to be able to interact with and touch all of the people. Like we at Anansi, Celene and I, we share a leadership role. And while she is the primary touch with everybody, I'm still participating in that. And the two of us together can directly cascade messages down and inspire people with goals and et cetera. That becomes harder to do once you're hitting that kind of 14 plus range. And one of the things that I've heard from many different leaders that I've spoken to in the industry is that's where it starts to become more challenging to sustain in the long term, both because your business model needs to change in order for it to kind of grow further. But also because that's when you start to have the higher overhead. That's when you potentially start to need an office because managing that many remote workers can potentially be difficult, right? And then you can go up even further than that. You know, I think that most of the people that we talk with and work with on a regular basis don't really aspire to go above the kind of 20 employee mark or, you know, around there. But each of those kind of levels, which are all firmly in the small business range, can really change what your day-to-day life looks like. And I would say that having an idea of what the roles that you want filled in your business are, how that relates to the number of people, and considering how close a touch you personally want to have with the people on your team and the work going out, as well as how much business you want to be responsible for bringing in as well, right? Like one of the things we mentioned is more mouths to feed equals more overhead necessary. And actually, something I've been seeing happen a lot in the industry is people with larger teams actually shrinking down and scaling down and becoming leaner and more specialized, more niched, higher touch, maybe working with a few key contractors. But I think it's becoming more popular even for those larger companies sometimes to shrink down. So anyway, things are shifting all the time, but something you want to consider definitely is how big you want to go so you don't just find yourself there accidentally and unhappy. Did you have anything to add to that, Celene?
No, except for that I could just listen to you like talk on and on forever. I guess that's why you have a podcast.
I guess that's why we're friends. Otherwise, that we'd have difficulty being friends. I talk a lot.
Oh yeah, I know. I'm just like absorbing everything you're saying and loving it.
Yeah. Did you want to talk a little bit more around kind of our scalable role? Because that's something that I learned from a mentor of mine a few years ago that was really critical for us, that kind of idea of the strategist role. Did you want to talk about that a little bit more?
So yeah, as you mentioned, it's kind of that single scalable role. So if anyone listening is unfamiliar with Anansi and you heard, say, talking a few minutes ago about the person that we hired to handle projects start to finish and do the strategy and the writing, those are our content strategists. And the idea of the single scalable role is that it's basically one position that you can easily hire and add more of to increase capacity and, you know, potentially let go or decrease the number of people doing that to reduce your capacity. So you can very quickly scale up or down just by kind of control C, control Ving that same type of person over and over. So we have 4 strategists. But for example, if we suddenly got really busy and we knew that we were going to be consistently at this higher level of busyness, we could hire another strategist. Similarly, if we got really slow and there was some reason that we thought, oh, this is going to be like the new normal for us forever and ever and ever, okay, I'm not even going to suggest like letting go of a strategist because it kills me to say that I love them all so much. But in a hypothetical world where this isn't our business we're talking about, you know, you can scale down as well. So most of the time, this is like the production role type of person. So that could be like developers or graphic designers or, you know, depending on your business, what that is, right? Like you're not going to say scale up admin people. You're not going to hire 4 admin roles. If you're a company of like, you know, 500, you could have 4 admin. But in general,
this is one of the ideas that like, it depends on your company, but this is something that that particular role will shift depending on what it is that you deliver and where the value is. But it definitely, especially with the sales roller coaster, like these are people we hired as contractors so that they were getting work elsewhere as well. So that if there was less for us to do, their whole job also didn't depend on us and our capacity to provide at a certain level. At the same time, we would hit capacity quite a bit. So it would allow us to very quickly scale up or bring on skilled people capable of delivering that value without having to like source and hire them if we like on short notice or something.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess, like what are some other things to consider when you're kind of planning scaling? One of the big things is timeline. Like if you, if you grow really, really fast, that, you'll need to have that kind of single scalable role where you're quickly adding them in, but that can also be like pretty expensive upfront, pretty chaotic, and it can also affect quality. Like this is a completely different industry and example, but there is a brewery, a microbrewery nearby us that was like a very, very small microbrewery. And they just decided, I guess they got like some investors or whatever happened, and they expanded really quickly. And their beer was awful. Like it very suddenly got very awful. There was like, I don't know if it was like a bacterial infection or whatever it was, but like all their beers had this weird off flavor. And so people stopped buying their beers, and they had like a huge, like brand new multi-million-dollar facility and all these employees, and they had no revenue because they kind of took the fast expansion route. Of course, like, sometimes this works out really well if you have that upfront investment. Versus kind of the slow timeline is this is cheaper. You can bootstrap it, right? The slow growth, and you can control it easier. But it can also be constraining when there's like that all those costs in the middle that are adding up, and you're not reaching your revenue goals as fast as you'd like.
Yes, the messy middle, as we call it, where, things are moving, but they get messy as you start to scale. That's why it's good to think about a lot of this stuff ahead of time, because it's going to get messy as you start to grow and scale and move forward, no matter what. So the more that we can kind of mitigate that and, create a flow in the right direction, even if it's a little bit messy along the way, I think the better.
Yeah. And I guess like the very, very, very most important, but also very most obvious question that I see so many posts on all the time, or even people ask me directly, is what is going to be your very first hire?
Yeah. Yeah. And was that a question for me, or are you going to dig in?
You know what? I was going to dig in, but now I want to hear your thoughts on it.
No, no, just kidding. So what should your very first hire be? There are so many different conflicting answers to this question. But I would say the one that I hear the most often is an assistant of some kind, often a virtual assistant. That being said, just like so many of these things, there is there's a lot of stuff to consider around, what your particular business is, what your particular needs are. And a VA can be a lifesaver, but let's be real, it can also be a freaking nightmare. So I also hear quite a bit like project managers, operation managers. What did you do? Why don't you dig in a little bit to what you hear, and then I'll real talk it for you, Celene.
Yeah. So actually I went on like 5 digital agency groups and searched their like post history, because I was curious what other people say, because I have a lot of thoughts in my head on the topic, but that doesn't mean that they're like the best thoughts, or like, like you said, there's many ways you can do it. But actually like beyond like even compare, by far the most common suggestion that I saw people saying for their first hire is project managers. Although, operation managers were kind of in there too, but when you start to hear them like describing, the project managers, how they're really good because they can create processes and systematize things so you can start to scale, I realize that it's pretty much like there's a lot of overlap with operations, and it might just be kind of like how you name the role.
Yeah. Well, what do you think? Because it sounds like people want something, but I have found that there's sometimes a gap in between kind of what they think they want and what they actually want. So why do you think that a project or operations manager is one of the most common hires?
Just from reading what like people are saying and suggesting, it sounds like that's where they are having trouble is, they're really good at the selling. And, I would assume that at this point, they're probably also gonna, get like contractors or something, because you don't need a project manager without someone actually doing the project work. that, then it's kind of taking out that chunk of like middle management stuff of managing contractors or doing other things like that. And I mean, but like to get someone who can do operations, especially, okay, so let's be real. Your very first hire is also going to wear a lot of hats. Like
yes. Celene, I mean, she wasn't my very first hire, but she was my first hire that stuck. So you've definitely got some perspective there.
Yeah. So like someone isn't going to come in and be like, oh, I'm only doing this a very, very, very small, narrow role. Unless you hire like a production role, like a developer or something, then they're probably not going to be doing like admin stuff as much. But like, like you said, an assistant is, I think, like, so after reading all the comments and people's thoughts, I feel like a lot of times when they say PM or operation manager, it's kind of the higher paid version of the assistant. And then when people say VA, they think like an overseas or entry level assistant. But like, regardless of which kind of option it is, it's basically someone that picks up the slack and helps do all the smaller day-to-day things that are just getting dropped when you're a busy entrepreneur, whether that be like responding to emails, doing admin, liaising with projects, keeping things organized, doing like research into different things, like all those kind of things in one is, like whatever you call it, that's very often the first hire.
Yeah, I also wouldn't be surprised. Like, if we're going to real talk this, something that I see a lot and have definitely experienced myself is people looking for a VA, getting a VA, and being disappointed by the narrowness of what the VA can do, which is, I think, sometimes where that desire for a project manager comes from. And we have attempted to hire a project or operations manager more than once. And ultimately, that role morphed into something that was kind of VA related. And for us, it turned out to be like a chief of admin, actually like a tech officer, like someone who manages our tech all the time. And we just set up our projects simply enough that people can hold themselves accountable. And then we have, like the oversight of Celene over everyone. But I think this does come back to that idea, like you said, of like a catch-all, someone to do the stuff that you don't like. Now, I definitely sought out a virtual assistant as my very first hire. That was how Celene originally joined the company. I think I hired 2 or 3 people before her. At least one. Yeah, no, 2 or 3. One of the things I found through, like, I did a whole bunch of like reading and researching about it. I ended up using a service called Virtual Staff Finder, not to get you guys too hung up on tools, and read a book. Ooh, I'm having a brain fart on the title of the book. If I can think of it, we will mention it in the show notes and add it there. But one of the things that I really read was kind of twofold if you're considering hiring an assistant. One is understand the hat or the role that person primarily needs to fill. And this is even more necessary and even more challenging because of the phenomenon that Celene was talking about, where, your first hire is also going to wear a lot of hats if you wear a lot of hats. I think that's what makes this so challenging. The other part, which is something that each and every one of you can do now if you want, is start thinking to yourself, what tasks in the business do you want to hand off? And the book that I was reading had a 3-step process for this, which starts with, what are the things that you are really, really bad at? And then what are the things that you really do not want to be doing? And what are the things that you really should not be doing? In that order. And you look at that list, and from that list, you seek out patterns. And for instance, if you're looking to hire someone who's really, really good at graphics, they're probably not going to be as good at stuff like the tech side of things or word processing, for example. If you're looking for someone to like sort your email and answer your phone, they probably will not be able to like update the back end of a WordPress website. We as entrepreneurs wear so many hats that we often look for this kind of super VA. And even though you can definitely hire what's called a GVA, which is a general VA who does do a little bit of everything, you're still not going to get a super person who can do everything. I know it's tempting.
Unless you're me. Just kidding.
Basically I did. I hired Celene and she could do all of those things. And I was like, holy cow, you are not going to be a VA for me. Like, because someone who can do all those things and has so many skills, like I want you doing something a lot higher level. Which is funny because, I found the golden goose and then I was like, oh crap, I'm not letting this golden goose just, be wasted on the lower level stuff. So if you do find one of those people, protect them, love them, hold them close. Maybe not literally, but
or literally
if they're okay with that. But that being said, like you're probably not going to find that person. So doing this process is not about finding someone who can literally do everything that you're bad at, everything you don't want to do, and everything that you should be doing. But by looking at the patterns and prioritizing it in that order, then you can look at and see what sort of thing and what sort of direction of all those different directions might be the most important for you to start with. And I think that is really important. And there's a whole bunch more deeper concepts under this. I can see in our notes that you have for me to talk about a concept called QBR and all this other stuff. And I think I'll leave that for another podcast just because it's so deep. You can go so deep into this. But it does come back to, do you like doing project work? Do you like sales work? Do you like operations work? Right? Like within that, is there an area that you're consistently getting stuck? But if you're hiring a VA, know that you are probably still going to be doing a lot of the thinking and planning, and I've probably quoted this in other podcasts, but this book, Clockwork by Mike Michalowicz, I can't recommend it enough, author of Profit First. One of the things he talks about is that you start out by basically delegating the hands. Like you delegate somebody to do a task. And then once they successfully complete that task, you delegate for them to potentially do a project or a series of tasks. And ultimately, the goal is for them to be responsible for outcomes as opposed to tasks. But you don't just meet somebody and immediately, make them responsible for an outcome and walk away, especially not at the VA level, maybe at like the C level. What you want to do is you want to incrementally adjust the amount of trust and responsibility you're giving them until they can handle those higher level things. But ultimately, if you truly want to get something off your plate, then you need to work towards delegating the outcome.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's funny because I've actually been hired in roles where they immediately delegate the outcome without really delegating the tasks. And I've been like, well, this is great, but like, I don't know anything about your company or how it runs or your processes. Like, I can't just step in and work magic. Like, first of all, I'd probably like do something that's not the way you do things and everyone would get angry. Secondly, like, I don't know yet what would be the best way to do this for like this kind of company and dynamic and how they work.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Now, I do want to talk about one elephant in the room, which is the overseas versus local conversation about hiring a virtual assistant. Just in the sense that some people, I think fewer and fewer people these days are kind of reticent to hire somebody or, a little bit reluctant to hire somebody from overseas. There are definitely challenges. I think we've talked about this in our hiring episodes and stuff. There are definitely advantages versus challenges for hiring overseas. As long as you are paying a living wage in that country, I don't think there are any ethical concerns about doing things overseas. But, depending on your industry and the role that you're needing to hire and et cetera, this is once again something we could do a whole separate episode on, because sometimes it makes sense to make the extra investment to hire someone local, especially if they're going to be doing like local calling or interactions or, a lot of like high touch points with things in the area, or they need to understand kind of more cultural or area specific needs. But you can also get a lot of really, really, really good work from people overseas and save your money and your income if you are growing your team to be able to hire those roles more locally if and when you can afford it, if that's the stage that you're at.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a very strong misconception that if you hire overseas, you're automatically getting inferior quality. And that you'll never, I've heard people say straight up, you'll never get like a good employee overseas, which first of all, like I just straight up think isn't true. But I think it depends on your approach and how you're hiring. But because we've obviously like done the hiring, I don't know what it's called, like the carousel. We've gone around and around a few times, and I've met applicants, whether we ended up hiring them or not, who are like they're expats, so they may be living overseas, but they were born and raised somewhere in North America or an English speaking country, maybe Britain or Australia or wherever. Their English is perfect, they're educated there. They just happen to be living in a place now where they can afford to work for like what the standard wage is there because their expenses are lower. Or people who like I interviewed someone who was in Colombia and he has like a master's degree and he was super smart. And, so a lot of people think automatically hiring overseas means that you're getting inferior quality, but that just isn't the case at all. Like 100% like Kevin. Okay. I know Kevin, poor Kevin, he's always going to blush because I always talk about how awesome he is. But honestly, like, I don't think I could find a Kevin in North America. Well, he's in Mexico, he's in North America, and like Canada or the States or an English speaking country. I don't like, he's so awesome. There's nobody else like him in any other country.
Yeah, that is very, very much.
That's true. Like, you know what I mean? Like we could hire locally and we still would not have someone with that like level of dedication and give a damn. So
yeah, absolutely. I also want to say on just a slightly related note, one of the questions that I hear a lot that's kind of a chicken or an egg thing is whether to hire something. If you're not hiring out admin, right? If we're thinking about those three main buckets, sales, admin, and projects, right? Your first hire is going to be in one of those three categories. I hear a lot, is it better to hire sales first or to hire production out first? And I have heard top tier marketing brains or business leadership brains that I respect very greatly saying the exact opposite. I have heard that it's better to hire out sales first because then you can focus on creating a really, really value-driven experience for your client. And if you can't deliver the experience and the result that they need, that there's no point in making a whole bunch of sales. I've also heard that, and therefore, better to hire out sales so you can focus your personal attention on the delivery. And I've also heard the opposite. I've heard that no one will ever be able to sell the way you do as a business leader. And so it's much better for you to focus on sales and hire out production because that way you'll be able to ramp up your sales much faster, much to the, cringing response of all of the introverts out there who are like, oh gosh, I don't want to become that person. Like I've heard people say, you just have to become that person, which, I'm not a fan of any quote unquote, you just have to approach most of the time. Well, other than, like if you want to grow, then putting yourself into uncomfortable situations is necessary, but that doesn't mean that your business model has to revolve around you becoming a super salesperson if it like gives you hives to even think about it, So I personally don't think there is a consistent right answer that quote unquote everybody agrees on. I think it really depends where you yourself are at, because I've also heard that hiring and experienced on both sides, but hiring sales is a very, very difficult role to hire. And I've heard, now this is not a stat that I myself have looked into myself, but I have heard from more than one mentor that 50% of all sales hires in the US at least don't work out. So, I mean, again, I don't know what that is relative to overall hiring stats, but I mean, hiring anybody can be challenging. So I think that's why a lot of people kind of stay safe and go for the VA line of thought.
Yeah, it's funny because when I was kind of doing the research and looking on the groups, there was one guy who over and over insisted like sales always has to be the first hire, sales always has to be the first hire. And he got like some real, and this isn't a thread where there was like, maybe 10 people saying project manager or something similar. And he was like the only person saying sales. And he got a lot of pushback on it. But I saw like in another post, completely unrelated to him or completely unrelated to hiring, where he, kind of was more vulnerable, and he said he's always struggled with sales, and that's just not who he is. So then for him, obviously, like, sales probably is the best step you can do, because ultimately, if like you said, you make that list of what you hate, what you're not good at, etc. If you hate sales and you're not good at it, like, someone is going to do a better job than you can at selling your product.
Yeah, totally. Something to consider here as well is that once growth starts to happen, both on the financial side or internally around your company, it can happen really, really fast. We've already mentioned this, how you might kind of stumble into a period of fast growth. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to think of this up front, so that you don't, accidentally stumble into a business that maybe is profitable, but you're not happy with, or maybe that's profitable, but not sustainable. Or maybe isn't profitable, but it has lots of, sales and projects going out.
Giant two-headed sea monster.
Oh, gosh. But all of these things do happen. They happen often, and they can happen very quickly. For us, we definitely have grown fast, not necessarily compared to those like insane stories that you might read on the internet or something, but certainly it has felt very rapid. And we often look back at where we were a year ago and kind of are baffled and like, wow, that was only a year ago. But for us, as we've mentioned, it did start as just me. And then we grew in the sense that I initially hired 2 assistants back when I was running a full web agency. And then through a period of doing customer development interviews, or info interviews, as I called them, and kind of researching more, I realized that what was my passion was actually what basically people were looking for, which was copy and content. And also, if I'm going to be honest, I realized that like building full-on websites with copy at the quality and capacity that I wanted to be doing them. Keep in mind, this is also 5 or 6 years ago. It was overwhelming. And quite frankly, even though I was decent at it, I knew basic elements of design, basic elements of code, basic elements of strategy, all this different type of stuff. I actually realized that I fucking hated it. I'm just going to be honest. Like, there are so many moving parts that go into a website. You guys, our listeners, I'm sure you guys know, because this is what y'all do, right? I work with people who do this stuff all the time, and I'm so impressed and have so much respect, because between, the design, the development, the oversight, the launch, the quality assurance, not to mention all of the conversation with the clients and the copy. And I am someone who not only has ADHD, but like just a really, really in-depth, like I just go really deep into things and struggle with perfectionism and stuff. And just hiring a VA or 2 to do the kind of caliber and capacity of websites I wanted to do, I was going crazy. Even with someone to like handle more of the kind of like tech and web setup side, and someone to handle more of the design side while I kind of oversaw things and did the sales and stuff. I was just really not happy. It was a lot of work. And as I dug into it, I realized that copy, which was my background, this is why it's even funny, because I was like, I'll build full websites and do the copy, and that'll be my specialty, is that I do the copy. And it wasn't until I was at a conference and talking to people and being like, well, I've been going in this direction. I've created some marketing momentum with the cannabis industry in this niche I'm working in. I think, it was a burgeoning industry in Canada. I thought it could be really big. But copy, copy, that was where I came from. That was what I loved. And I realized that I would just lovingly spend so much time over the copy aspects of projects, and just, it felt like pulling teeth to do the rest. So I started talking to people, and, I came to realize that people, especially other digital agency leaders, copy was a problem for them. And the parts that were like pulling teeth for me were actually things that other people really enjoyed. And that's what they wanted to spend all their time doing. And I had just been kind of so in my head about what I thought people wanted to do or needed, it was almost like, oh, well, I love doing copy so much. Like, I can't imagine a world where that is the main focus of my business. I also, I'm going to be real vulnerable here. As someone who has been writing and a writer ever since I was a kid, I've been writing professional copy since I was a teenager. My mom was an entrepreneur. She put me to work. She did. Still does sometimes. But like, I had to face the fact that even though my dream when I was a kid was like narrative and writing books and all this different type of stuff, that it was very, very difficult for me to just sit down in a room and write. It was very difficult for me to work alone all day. After coming from a very social environment in my last job. And even though I loved writing and I was really good at it, it was extremely challenging to have that production work be the focus of my day. And so I had this conundrum because I had something that I loved, that I had experience in, that people needed, that I didn't think I could do alone. And then on top of it, I had 2 VAs that, while they were great, their skills weren't really in the direction of what I needed if I was going to pursue copy. So I did a lot of like sitting down and thinking. I did some exercises and wrote some stuff out. I went in search of my why, what I wanted. And this, like some people, actually, no, I think in our community, I think most of us understand, thanks to Simon Sinek, the power of why, both on an intrinsic and on an extrinsic level, right? For personal motivation as well as external reward. And I came to realize that what I loved more than anything was the internet and tech's power to spread information that can help people. And then I love building strong communities through the power of the written word. And at first I was like, how the heck is like building communities and, the work that I've done working at like a university with their student services and all that, like how can I connect that with running a digital agency and what I'm doing? And that's where some of those answers started to come out for me in terms of wanting a team rather than being a solopreneur with, a few contractors or, with some VAs or something. I realized that I wanted the social experience of working with a team. I like leading a team. And also, quite frankly, that if I was going to run this business for a long period of time, I didn't want to be doing the writing forever. Now, this is challenging because I was also a control freak and a perfectionist and didn't want writing that I hadn't touched or approved or edited or worked on to go out. But ultimately I was able to work around that and create that. And now I don't actually, like years later, I don't even touch most of the copy that goes out, right? Like all of the strategists have access to my time and I work on high level training and I work on individual projects. But again, at the capacity that we need to sell to support the team, also to do the work, do amazing work and help the amount of people we want to help because we do work on a subcontracting basis. So we work with the same people over and over again often. That like, there's no way I could personally touch everything. But all of those things help me decide when to scale, how big I wanted to scale. Like I do get hives when I think of running a company of like 14 people or something like that. Like I do like that tight knit feeling, that tight knit group feeling. And all of that was really scary. I'll be honest. I was depressed for some of this time. I was really confused. I didn't know what to do. And if I'm going to be real, finding my why and realizing that, and now it's almost trippy. It's kind of cool because now it's part of our quarterly planning and everyone's on the same page, right? Like we weave strong communities. That's what we do by connecting people to products and services that can really, really enrich their lives, right? We also enrich the lives of the partners that we work with. And anyway, I love it. But all of this was hard and it was messy and it required me to do a lot of like digging and thinking. And we've shifted kind of where we're going and stuff along the way. But all of that was like really, really critical. That was really critical. And this is all before Celene even joined the team, before we started to expand and bring those people on, like Celene did come on as a VA. And then I realized just how appealing it would be to have somebody in a leadership role, right? Those of you who've listened to this podcast before know that Celene is one of my team. I own the business as a sole proprietorship. But we operate as a team, as partners, as leaders together. She leads all of the operations, right? Anyway, so it's been a big journey. Definitely, like that jump was the biggest one. There was another jump when we started to hire our first strategist, adding people on, etc. Did you want to talk at all to your experience? Because it was basically just me and Celene, and sometimes an assistant for a while before we kind of scaled up from there.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you encapsulated it a lot, but yeah, definitely, for me, I being like the team of two and stuff, I'll speak like up to the emotional side of things and to this like practical side of things. But I remember, especially, because I had a baby at the time, there were times that I'd get up at like 3:30 in the morning and start work at 4, like have my baby all day. And then I'd be like working till midnight sometimes that night if there were deadlines to get projects done or whatever else it was, when we were both still kind of actively doing project works, like putting together content strategy briefs and stuff. Or like proofreading drafts or whatever it was, like it was nuts. And then like, fast forwarding to now after we scaled and like, I know exactly also I'm not in a production role, but like at the beginning of the week, I pretty much know what my week's going to look like. I know what my month is going to look like. Like I'm definitely like, as you narrow in the roles and wear less hats, you can be so focused on what you're doing and getting it done and having that like really consistent routine, which I love. In a practical sense, definitely, like you said, that was a big jump when we hired our first 2 strategists. And I loved it. I mean, working with like copywriters and stuff that were, we didn't have necessarily like super consistent copywriters. So there's always like that hit or miss, like, oh, are they going to like hit the elements of the outline that we've sent? Or are they going to follow basic copywriting principles today? Going to in-house strategists who like, we could consistently train and work with every single day and see them grow and know their quality and know how reliable and awesome they are and get to know them personally and stuff. I absolutely loved. And then the other kind of big jump for me was when we hired Jen for sales, because that was kind of our first time that we'd hired like a big full-time person whose salary we have to cover, who has a completely non-production role.
Yeah, I think that's really big. I mean, we had hired full-time overseas. Obviously, both you and I are on full-time salaries.
I didn't have to hire myself.
Yeah, you didn't have to hire yourself. That's true. But that's true, because the strategist, as we mentioned before, that was like a scalable role. So we kind of we mitigated the risk a little bit that way. But you're right. When we hired Jen, it was scary because it was definitely a big need, in the sense that because we do work with the same partners over and over again, like I was finding that even though I wasn't doing a lot of production anymore, just keeping on top of both the business leadership. There are a lot of people out there who very successfully balance both business leadership and sales, but especially since my personal goals have always revolved around reducing my hours so that I can spend more time in the community, and also like raising a family and being with my family and all this type of stuff. I really identified quickly that just staying connected to everyone that we work with. And I'd have these bigger and better ideas of how we could make things easier for them or help guide them through the process. And they just wouldn't get off the ground, basically. And it was hard to admit to myself, I'll be honest. This was probably the beginning of last year. But there came a point where like Celene and I sat down and we were like, okay, we can either stay the size that we are, give ourselves a sizable raise and bringing us to kind of our financial goals and like keep things going as they are and be responsible for maintaining ourselves. Or we could take the riskier option, hire someone to do account management and to help with like prospecting and to give us ideas on how to grow and et cetera, eat that potential raise and put it in there, and take on this additional risk and everything as well. But, we will be able to keep our roles more narrow. And there was a point where both of us, and we're both workaholics, to be honest, or we have been workaholics in the past. That's our history. And we had a quarterly planning where we were almost a little bit, at least I felt almost a little bit embarrassed to be like, I kind of want to keep working less. I could maintain this, but I would rather kind of take the risk and invest in ourselves and go out on a limb and be able to maintain a lifestyle where I can really focus a little bit closer on stuff, on the parts of the business that I like, and just work less, and I believe if I remember correctly, your exact words were something along the lines of like, I really like being a mom and I still want that to be my first priority. I don't know, maybe I'm misremembering, but it was just this kind of really vulnerable, cool moment.
I feel like that's something I could have said.
Yeah. That was a really powerful moment because that was a hard decision. And I'm not going to lie and say that it was like a super smooth, like hiring Jen was amazing and like super simple, in the sense that like our processes we'd set up for hiring were very effective, but it was a huge shift and is still, almost a year later, something that we're continually like workshopping. We've had to totally rehash our roles because now personal responsibility for the future and finances of the business does not rest solely with either one of us, right? Like we're not the people. We were kind of splitting the sales role and account management role before that between the two of us, and now neither one of us. We support her. We have hit the point where she is fully responsible for outcomes and has to come to us to let us know if there's something that she's lacking. And that is the most empowering and cool thing in the world, but it's also freaking terrifying. Now, I had one more thing that I wanted to touch on. I'm realizing that we are pretty much at time here, and I'd like to maybe dig into this in a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to go super, super high level and then recap, and potentially we can consider digging into this for another episode or maybe doing another form of
I saw your notes and I think that would be an awesome episode.
Okay, cool. But it's my theory of delegation. Now, this is something that I came up with back in the chaotic days. So it isn't something that I've fleshed out in the way that I want, and have kind of searched through my old notes, but really need to do a lot more digging to be able to pull up the meat of it and really flesh it out. But my theory of delegating is that you can delegate one of three ways. You can delegate up, you can delegate laterally, or you can delegate down. And each one of these has their own ups and downs. But when you're considering delegating a role and you're trying to decide whether you want to hire somebody full-time in-house, whether you want to work with a contractor or white label agency, or, just a super simple low-level VA or something. And one of the things that I like to consider is this idea of whether you need to or would prefer to delegate up laterally or down. So delegating up is when you're delegating to someone who is better at things than you. So it's usually much higher cost, right? You're making a much larger investment. Like when people delegate to us for copy, they're usually delegating up, in the sense that we are specialists in this field. We come with the process fully prepared. You basically, we're like plug and play. We will do almost all of the work and just basically let you know what we need from you in order to successfully deliver an element of your project or service. So let's say you're looking at it and you're thinking, wow, copy is something I freaking hate on projects. Or maybe SEO is something that you really hate on projects, right? Often SEO is something that people delegate up, whether it's organic or paid SEO, right? Paid traffic like PPC could be an example for this. But a lot of these have versions that include delegate laterally or delegating down as well. So when you're delegating laterally, you're usually delegating to somebody on your team in some way, or who is a contractor, in the sense that they have somewhat equivalent skills to you. You could be doing this yourself, but it doesn't really make sense for you to do so, right? And I'll just talk about delegating down to give kind of a bit of a comparison. So delegating down is when, for example, you're delegating to a pair of hands or a VA, in the sense that you have to provide the process. Almost all major decisions, you're going to have to check over that work, but the cost is going to be usually fairly affordable. So when you like doing something, but you're just over capacity for it, that's often when it's a good choice to delegate down, because you just need somebody to like take on the slack, pick up the slack a little bit, and you're still going to be like looking it over. So like, for example, when we were hiring writers to do the first drafts, and then I was going through and editing them before they were going out to the client, that's an example of delegating down. Likewise, the first few like VAs that I hired. Now, delegating laterally, just to kind of return to that, is somewhere in the middle. So it can be delegating to someone who has similar skills than you, to a contractor who maybe has some process or some elements and they can work independently. Delegating laterally, they should be able to work independently. But it's still going to require touch from you, and it's still going to require some thought. And usually you have to be good enough at that thing to assess whether the quality is there, even if you're not going to be personally like correcting it or fixing it or et cetera before it goes out. Anyway, so like I said, there's a lot there. I could dig much further into it, and I'm not going to for today, because we've already covered a lot of different stuff, and I think this could be a whole other thing in itself. But just something to keep in mind. If you're feeling a bit confused about, you do realize you want to scale in some way and you want to hire, but you're not sure kind of what direction to go in, I would strongly suggest doing the work around which things do you suck at, which things do you hate doing, and which things are you maybe good at but probably shouldn't be doing because they're not your best work, or it's not your role. And then consider for, the different bucket the things on that list, right? So you can see kind of what buckets of roles there are there, and then decide for some of them whether you'd like to delegate up, delegate laterally, and delegating down, or delegate down. And one thing I will say for delegating up, if that's something you want to do, but you're concerned about the cost, is I will say that most of the time when you're delegating up, you are doing that for a client-facing part of a part of a client project and marking that work up rather than paying for it out of pocket. Anyway, so I'll just leave you guys with that thought and just kind of quickly recap over what we've covered today. So basically today, talking about scaling up from a team of one, we talked about some of the reasons people might want to scale. Usually getting more time back is one of the major reasons. And also creating more security for you is one of the major reasons. If done well, you can also generate significantly more revenue or profit, although usually that's long-term rather than short-term. Now, in terms of why you might want to remain on your own or as an ultra small team, like a partnership, having to manage or organize a team on its own, maybe something you don't want to do. Giving up control is one of the biggest ones that we read about and look at and hear about all the time. And higher overhead is massive. And of course, some of this can be mitigated by taking the in-between route of hiring contractors or white label agencies to do aspects of project work. If you do want to scale, things to consider. How big do you want to grow? What kind of category of size do you want to fit into? And how will that affect how close you want to be to the projects and to the other people on your team? Consider what tasks of the business you want to hand off, and then what roles or outcomes ultimately you want to hand off. Try to bucket the tasks you want to do. Consider what your timeline for growth is. This is something we didn't dig into too much, right? But fast expansion can be hard to keep up with, but also cost more money up front and can be crazy chaotic. Slower growth can be cheaper and easier to control, but it can be very constraining, especially when you're stuck in the middle. And then, of course, what will be your first hire is a really important question to ask. What role do you want to work towards hiring? And then how are you going to hire? Are you going to delegate up? Are you going to delegate laterally? Are you going to delegate down? Did I miss anything there?
I think that pretty much covers it.
Awesome. Awesome. So as usual, we would love to hear your stories. If you're a solopreneur who has tried scaling and has scaled back down, that's a story we've heard before. We'd love to hear about it. If you're considering scaling up, what issues you've had scaling up, by all means, email us. My email is say@anancycontent.com. You can send me, questions, stuff that you're interested in hearing more about, stuff you'd like us to cover. And we're happy to touch on it in one of our future episodes. Yeah, for sure. Future topics you have, whether this was helpful for you, we'd love to hear it. And of course, if this is helpful for you, by all means, hit that subscribe button, hit like, add a comment, etc. It makes a big difference for us. All right. Well, that is it for today. Hopefully this was helpful to you. As always, I hope you have an excellent rest of your day. And that does it for another amazing episode of the Say It Online podcast. Join us next week. And don't forget to like and subscribe, whether it's iTunes, whatever your favorite podcast player is. It is always, always appreciated. It really makes a difference for us. It helps us get this word out to more people. As always, this episode was brought to you by our sponsor and Say's own business, Anancy Content. If you're a digital agency owner and you're still wasting too much time chasing down content that maybe isn't even all that great, let's talk. We've spent years working on the best process for selling, planning, and delivering amazing conversion content for your client projects. Better yet, we moosh our process to yours so that your client and you have a seamless and amazing experience the entire time through. If you're interested, just go to our website. That's www.anancycontent.com. That's ANANSI content.com. And just click Let's Talk. I'd love to chat with you. Someone else on the team would also love to chat with you too. Hope you have an amazing rest of your day.